Alright, so let's continue with evaluating the trigonometric functions. So at this point, we now want the exact value for the following. So starting off with A, sine of 135 degrees. So in these types of problems, like I had mentioned previously, what we should be doing is that we should be finding our reference angle. Once we have our reference angle, then we ask ourselves, okay, well, what quadrant is this reference angle in? And once we know the reference angle, we get the magnitude of the value, and knowing which quadrant we're in, we get the sign. Is it positive or is it negative? So if we're dealing with the sine of 135 degrees, in this case there should only be one reference angle, and that would be 45 degrees. So we would have a reference of 45 degrees, and then we ask ourselves, what quadrant are you in? So if you're in quadrant 1, you go up to 90 degrees, and in quadrant 2, you go up to 180. And therefore, 135 degrees is between 90 and 180. So we are a reference of 45 degrees, and we are in quadrant 2. So now, all you need to ask yourself is, well, what is the sine of 45 degrees? And the sine of 45 degrees is root 2 over 2. And then you ask yourself, well, in quadrant 2, is the y value positive or negative? And it's positive. So we remain with an answer of root 2 over 2. So again, what do we look for? We always look for that reference angle. Once we have that reference angle, we just try and find out what quadrant we're in, and that tells us what the sine is. So let's go to B. So B is asking us the cosine of 4 pi over 3. So for this, we should automatically be seeing that we have something over 3. So in this case, we know that our reference angle will be 60 degrees. Now, am I 60 degrees in quadrant 1, 60 degrees in quadrant 2, 60 degrees in quadrant 3? That's the question. So to do this, I would simply just look at the fraction. And this is a really simple way of doing it. Now we know that half of a turn would be pi. And in this case, I have 4 pi over 3. And 4 over 3 is just a little bit bigger than 1, which means you are just a little bit bigger than 1 pi. So that means you're just a bit bigger than half of your circle. So you should be in quadrant 3. So you will get cosine of 60 in quadrant 3. So you ask yourself, what is the cosine of 60 degrees? And the answer would be half. And then you ask yourself, okay, well, what's the sign for cosine in quadrant 3? The cosine is always negative because that's your x value. So you get an answer of negative half. All right, cotangent of negative pi over 3. So this negative pi over 3 as a rotation is just a little bit of a subtle trick. The negative tells you that instead of going counterclockwise, you're now going clockwise, but you're still dealing with a reference angle of 60 degrees. And pi over 3 just means that you are 1/3 of pi. And 1/3 of pi means that you have to end up only with a rotation of 60. So this would result in a rotation of 60 degrees down. So you would be in quadrant 4. So your cotangent is really negative 60. Now, once we get this, we can say, okay, well, what is cotangent? Cotangent is cosine over sine. So you can then tell yourself, okay, well, the cosine over sine. We know that one of them is going to be negative because we're below the x-axis, which means the y is negative, but the x is positive. So I'm going to put a negative in the front. There's cosine of 60, and then there's sine of 60. All I need to do is divide. So all I do is take out that 2 because they're common to the top and the bottom in the denominator. So I get negative 1 over the root of 3, but I need to rationalize. So I multiply top and bottom by root 3, and I get root 3 over 3, and because there was a negative, I keep that negative. All right, secant of negative 210 degrees. So again, for this question, we ask ourselves, what's our reference angle? Well, in this case, our reference angle is somewhere between that 180 and that 270, let's say, right? Because that 210 is telling you that you need to be somewhere there. However, there's a negative in the front. And this negative means that you are doing a rotation in the opposite direction. So rather than going upwards and ending up in quadrant 3, because you're just a bit bigger than 180, you're going downwards and you're going to do a little bit more than half your circle, which means you end up in quadrant 2. And what would your reference angle be? Well, 180 to 210 would be 30 degrees. So you have the secant of 30 degrees in quadrant 2. And what does secant actually mean? Well, secant is a reciprocal. It's the reciprocal of 1 over cosine. So I can also rewrite this as 1 over the cosine of 30, which would then be 1 divided by the negative root 3 over 2. The negative because, again, I'm in quadrant 2 and cosine is negative in quadrant 2. And once I rationalize this, I get negative 2 root 3 over 3. E, cosecant of pi over 4. Alright, so this one should be fairly simple. So we ask ourselves, pi over 4, what would your reference angle be? And in this case, I know that my reference is going to be a 45-degree angle. What quadrant am I in? Obviously in quadrant 1. So I get the cosecant of 45 degrees in quadrant 1. And all I need to ask myself is, okay, well, what is cosecant? Cosecant is a reciprocal. It's a reciprocal of sine. So it will be 1 over the sine of 45, which would be 1 divided by the root of 2 over 2. And once you flip that, rationalize, you get the answer of root 2. Now for the next one, tan of negative 11 pi over 6. So for this one, what I want you to do is just ask yourself, how much do you need for a full turn around your circle? You need 2 pi. Well, 11 pi over 6 is just a little bit less than 2 pi. So that means you're close to a whole rotation, but not there yet. And what does the negative tell you? You're going in the opposite direction, so you're going clockwise. So in other words, you should end up in quadrant 1, because you're going through quadrant 4, quadrant 3, quadrant 2, you end up in quadrant 1, and you're very close to making that whole full turn. So this would be the tan of 30 in quadrant 1. Now the tan of 30, we can either remember this from our remarkable angles chart, which would be the root of 3 over 3, or you can also tell yourself that tan is the sine over the cosine, and you would do the exact same thing. So you put the sine of 30 over the cosine of 30. They're both positive in this case because you are in quadrant 1.